In 1914, the French Grand Prix was held at Lyon in the south of France. And right from the start, it resolved itself into a battle between two cars exactly like these, Peugeot and Mercedes, France and Germany. It was symbolic. It was just a month before the outbreak of the First World War. French driver André Boileau, very popular with a great deal of verve and a great deal of talent, driving a Peugeot, was challenged by a four-car team from the Mercedes factory in Germany, and right from the outset was at a disadvantage because Mercedes were prepared to expend one or two of their vehicles in order to run him into the ground, which they did, but not until Boileau had given them considerable and somewhat unexpected competition. At times, in fact, he even managed to lead the race. And it was not until at the very dying moments that his Peugeot finally expired and Mercedes were able to sweep to a first, second and third place victory, an omen to the whole of the world that the situation was about to warm up considerably. Within months of the 1914 Grand Prix, the whole of Europe was at war. To the car manufacturers, it meant a complete change around. No more private cars, well, not many, and in Piccadilly Circus, a sign hung which read, "Please don't use a motor car for pleasure." Despite the major advances that the Europeans had made in car construction, the various armies still relied heavily upon horses, at least at the beginning of the war. In 1914, for example, the British could only muster a total of 2,000 vehicles. The British, therefore, went to war in buses. It was not unusual for armies to hire trucks or cars when they went on field manoeuvres, but when things really got tough, they simply made demands. When the Germans were just 30 kilometres from Paris, the French General Gallieni commandeered 600 Renault taxis and began his desperate defence. The taxi of the Marne had gone to war, and it makes me even more glad I wasn't there. It was not long, however, before the designers had realigned their sights to war use and began to produce first armoured cars and then subsequently tanks. Incidentally, there's a strong suspicion that the first inventor of the tank might have been an Australian, L.E. de Mol, who in 1912 submitted apparently feasible designs to the War Office in London. They were acknowledged, pigeonholed, and forgotten. Some years later, two Englishmen invented a tank which was acceptable, and for their efforts were awarded £15,000. Poor de Mol went to England to stake his claim for recognition. He received £965 for his expenses, he was decorated and sent home. The war acted as a forcing house for basic designs in Europe, but it didn't produce anything new or revolutionary. Instead, it taught the Europeans the benefits of more orderly production, standardisation and simplicity, all lessons that contributed to the development of post-war industry. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, they occasionally had days like this, and it is absolutely freezing, and one suddenly realises the distinct disadvantages of cars of this particular period with no heaters for a start, but not even no heaters, but just look at the air conditioning. That's not what the story's all about. In America, they didn't have to go to war at the same time that everybody else did, and private car production, for that reason, was not curtailed until 1917, which gave the American manufacturers and designers the opportunity to go ahead of their European counterparts. And they certainly did so in terms of pure numbers. By 1916, when this car was built, there was over 500,000 cars per year being built in the United States, and most of those by just 10 specific companies. The brawling, rambunctious, eccentric Dodge brothers, John and Horace, had been building components
for the motor industry for some considerable time, and specifically for Ford, but they had become increasingly disillusioned with the prices that old Henry was prepared to pay for those components. So they decided to build a car of their own, and they did so at a very opportune moment. In 1915, when this first Dodge was released, they sold 45,000 units. And if you think that's a lot, compare it with the Ford Motor Company's production of the day, which was 1,000 a day. And then compare that with the total United Kingdom production of Ford, who were the biggest manufacturers in the UK, of only 6,000 units per year. The Americans were well and truly on the way. And now I'm afraid we've got to go and drive this. About the only concession this car makes to any sort of comfort at all is the fact that it's got a self-starter, which means you didn't have to get out in this sort of weather to get it going. Other than that, oh, it's horrible. There's no windscreen wipers, and there's as much water on the inside of the windscreen as there is on the out. There's a great slit in the middle of it which drives all the water back directly into your face. It has effectively no brakes at all. And on roads like this one, which are fairly typical of the type of roads that one would have been driving through at the time, it's extremely uncomfortable and harsh and heavy. If this is nostalgia, they can have it. The Americans took the lead in three specific areas at this time: cheap cars, sports cars and luxury cars. In the cheap car market, Ford had held market supremacy for some considerable time with their Model T, with no competition whatsoever, until Chevrolet came along in 1915 with this model, the 490. So called because that's exactly what it cost, $490. Chevrolet attacked the Model T Ford market where they were most likely to be effective, in simplicity of design and in cost. Although the Chevrolet never quite got down to the cost of the T model Ford, it did offer a little more, like a self-starter and electric headlights, for example. The car really was quite strong, and it did gain favour very rapidly. Four-cylinder engine with good long-stroke facilities, meaning it could pull up hills very effectively indeed. In terms of operation, it's much the same as a modern car, a 3-speed floor-shift gearbox in an H pattern. The brakes I don't like at all. In fact, considering the year in which the car was made, they should have been better. Steering was a bit heavy, as were most cars of that particular vintage, but perhaps a little heavier, and because of the half-elliptic springs, there's a tendency for it to jump about a bit as well. So far as comfort is concerned, the 490 was no more or no less than other cheap cars of the same vintage. That is, it's very uncomfortable to drive for very long periods of time, but from the passenger's point of view, quite reasonable indeed, and there's a mile of legroom in the back, which was beautiful.
There's an interesting little story which concerns itself with the way in which General Motors acquired Chevrolet as a division eventually. William Durant, who had formed the General Motors organisation, lasted only 2 years as president before he was ousted by his financial backers because they didn't agree with his expansionist policies and they weren't too happy about his financial control of the organisation. Nevertheless, he maintained a vice presidency and had a fair bit of time on his hands. So he went behind GM's back and backed Louis Chevrolet into building the Chevrolet range of cars, which almost immediately became very successful. And since Durant had done it with GM stock, and since they were very successful, GM were virtually forced into accepting Durant back as president, with Chevrolet as the top of the line range. Despite all that success, however, the Chevrolet never ousted the T-model Ford from its position at the top of the United States market, at least not at this time. Even in 1921, the Chevrolet held 4% of the market, and the T-model Ford, with old Henry at the wheel, still held 60%.
A much smaller share of the market, but a significant one, was held by the sports car manufacturers, of whom perhaps the greatest may have been Mercer, with the Raceabout. This car became the dream of a generation of young Americans. It offered no soft options, no roof, no nothing, just a big engine and a big fuel tank. It's a model that has become a legend, and it symbolised the approaching era of bathtub gin and coonskin coats. The Mercer had a rival, which was almost its look-alike twin, and that of course was the fabulous Stutz Bearcat. In 1916, Cannonball Baker roared across America in one in just 11.5 days. Just 8 years earlier, it had taken the Thomas Flyer 42 days to do exactly the same trip. What had made the difference, of course, was the advent of bitumen roads, the first of which was laid in the United States in 1912. The better the roads, the faster people wanted to go, and somehow the 40-mile-an-hour top speed of the Model T no longer had a great deal of glamour. Of the American luxury cars of the day, the Pierce Arrow was as fine an example as you could find anywhere. This is a 1915 model, Type 66, 12.7 litre, 6-cylinder engine. Absolutely magnificent in terms of its engineering quality. Very snobby car, with a great deal of appeal for people like American presidents, and all of them from William Taft to Franklin Roosevelt owned at least one Pierce Arrow. This is an occasional rear seat. Very occasional, I would think. It's extremely uncomfortable. But I can imagine a situation in which an American president might like to have his passengers out of earshot.
sitting back here.
One of the most significant of the contributions that Pierce Arrow made to the history of the car was the development of cast alloy body panels, which they introduced in 1905 for their bigger touring cars because, rightly, they said they made the car lighter. By 1916, the Americans had really come to grips with luxury, and their cars included features like press-button gear selection, heaters, vacuum wipers, and curved windscreens. If the First World War contributed anything at all to the automobile, it was by way of engine design. Very soon after the war started, companies like Rolls-Royce, Mercedes and Fiat were all building aircraft engines for military use. In the USA, our old friend Henry Leland had by now had a war with Willie Durant, which was inevitable, and had left Cadillac and formed his own company, which he called Lincoln, after the ex-president. There he built engines for aircraft which he called Liberty. In a period of 18 months, he built 6,500 of them, and they were very successful. So much so that they put the company on a sound footing to go back into car manufacture after the war with a car which he called Lincoln. Soon after that, he sold Lincoln to Henry Ford, meaning that during his lifetime, Henry Leland had provided the top-of-the-range models for both GM and Ford, Cadillac and Lincoln. But perhaps the most famous aero-auto combination of all came from Switzerland. His name was Marque Wherrett, and if you've not heard of him, don't worry about it, not too many people have, and yet his engines powered over 50% of the Allied aircraft during the First World War. Planes like this SE-5A and the French Spad. And Wherrett's cars hold a special place in history. They were thoroughbreds in every sense of the word. They were called Hispano-Suiza, and this 1921 model was considered by many people to be the best car in the world, forever. The financiers were Spanish, the designer was Swiss, hence Hispano-Suiza. It really is the most lovely car to drive, at least 10 years ahead of its time, and one needs to keep convincing oneself that it really was built in 1921. It has a 6-cylinder engine of 6.5 litres in capacity, and therefore not really big by the standards of that period, and yet with a mile of power and torque. It can do almost anything, even though it's only coupled to a 3-speed transmission, which again is delightful to use despite the fact that it has no synchro mesh. It's exceptionally light and accurate to steer, much more so than a great many cars that are built even today. If it has a couple of flaws, one is that it's noisy, and particularly by Rolls-Royce standards, and that was one point which brought it into disfavour with some people. And the other one is that it's got a very bad line of windscreen, which means that you have to look under it or over it. It makes it almost impossible to look through it. Apart from that, I enjoy driving this car more than any other car that I can ever recall having driven. Immediately after the war, while the larger companies were re-gearing for peacetime production, a vast number of tiny companies dived into the gap. In the UK alone, there were over 90 manufacturers. Most of these had sunk without a trace in just a few years. Some remained, but for all of them, the emphasis was on austerity. There was true austerity, which came in the form of cycle cars, machines which were just that, motorbikes built up into cars. Most of these quickly vanished, but one remains, and seems to be blessed with the secret of eternity. Morgan, the classic three-wheeler that was designed originally and simply for the Malvern Hills, which were its home. Why anyone would have bought these early Morgans, however, I'll never know. They were the greatest idiot of a thing to drive ever conceived by man. The controls for throttle, mixture and advance and retard were on the steering column, operated by cables, and every time you turn the steering wheel they stretch the cables and adjustments are made that you don't want made at the very time that you can at least afford to have them made. The steering wheel on this vehicle is so flexible that it bends and twists under your hands, and any cornering effort at all brings your knuckles into contact with the oiler. There's only 2 gears, both forward, meaning that you also had no reverse. The engine was started with a crank through the gearbox, and it needed a valve lifter to be able to turn it over in the first place. And when the valve lifter was released, there was a fair chance you were going to get a kickback and a broken wrist. It was so unstable it was unbelievable. The springs were soft and there were no shock absorbers, and with just one wheel at the back wavering about through various camber changes, it wasn't surprising that quite a few of them fell over. Fortunately, Morgans did improve. If they hadn't, I'm extremely doubtful that they would have survived to today, let alone been a flourishing little company.
And then there was the middling austerity typified by the old bull-nosed Morris. Curious history this. It's one of the few cars that was built right throughout the Great War, and for much of it with American parts. American parts were not allowed into England during the war for private vehicles, but they were for commercial vehicles, so Morris designed a delivery van based around this car so they could guarantee himself a continued supply of parts. Ironically, at the end of the war, the Continental Motor Company, which had built the engine in the States, ceased production of the Cowley's engine, and Morris, instead of finding himself at the forefront of the market, found that he'd missed the post-war boom altogether. By the time he'd found new suppliers and got the Cowley rolling again, the whole market had plummeted in a sudden slump. Morris did the only thing possible. He slashed the price and went on cutting until within 9 months he'd reduced it by 35% from £525 to £299. By 1922, he was successfully challenging Ford UK by selling 6,900 motor cars per annum.
One of the essential problems facing the designers of automobiles at about this time involved itself with increased speeds, not too much improvement in roads, meaning they were still fairly rough, and they were trying to build some sort of longevity into their cars. They wanted them to last. That meant that they had to design flexible chassis which could accept the motion and the shock of bumps and things, and at the same time build onto them bodies which flexed at approximately the same rate so that they didn't split and crack. And some of them did that very well, and some of them had some difficulty with it, but this particular Vauxhall seemed to have achieved that standard very quickly. It is in fact a very pleasant and comfortable vehicle to drive for its age, and at the same time one can feel the flexing motion of the chassis and the body together. And despite its age, there are no cracks in it, and it is in particularly good condition. But what makes this Vauxhall important is that it represents a whole change of direction for the car. Until the First World War, the car had been something for the rich, and it would have gone on that way for a long time. But in the war, tens of thousands of men learned to drive, in trucks, tanks, armoured cars, and staff cars like this Vauxhall, and literally millions got rides in them. When they came home, they had travelled, they had experienced mobility, and they had, however briefly, experienced the personal freedom that motorised transport could bring.
At just exactly the right moment, a gentleman by the name of Herbert Austin, who had begun his career with Wolseley but then went out on his own, introduced what he called a real car in miniature. The first Austin 7 was released in 1922, and it was a real car in the sense that it could do 50 miles per hour and it gave 60 miles per gallon, but it sold for only £165. And the reason it was possible to keep the price down to that is because it was very tiny and because it provided absolutely no luxury appointments whatsoever. Just a very austere Austin. The 7 spread around the world, being built under licence in France, Germany, America and Japan, and it became known affectionately as the Chummy. It was the first mini people's car and it remained in production until 1938. The true day of the car had finally arrived.